Right, so good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all here. Um, this evening, we have a fantastic lecture by Professor Anna Maria Busse Berger. Um, Professor Busse Berger is a distinguished professor of music emerita at University of California, Davis. Her research focuses on medieval and Renaissance music theory, historiography, and ethnomusicology, with particular attention to notation, memory, and the relationship between music, mathematics, and cultural history. She studied music and German studies in Germany and Norway before completing her PhD in musicology at Boston University. Her publications include Mensuration and Proportion Signs, a foundational study of rhythmic notation in early music, and Medieval Music and the Art of Memory, which received the Walsberry Award from the Society of Music Theory and the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award. Her later work has expanded into global and cross-cultural perspectives, including The Search for Medieval Music in Africa and Germany, 1891 to 1961, which was awarded the Bruder-Nettel Prize by the Society for Ethnomusicology. Her research has also been recognized by the American Musicological Society. In addition to her books and articles, she co-edited the Cambridge History of 15th Century Music and has held fellowships at institutions including the Guggenheim Foundation and she has served as co-editor of Archiv für Musikwissenschaft and as a member of the Directorium of the International Musicological Society. Anna Maria, we're absolutely anxious to hear what you have to say. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Barak, for this very generous introduction. And I'm very happy to be with you. So much has been written on Jesuit missionaries in the last 50 years, how they followed the colonial expansion of the European powers and missionized and explored almost every part of the world. Sometimes they did not manage to convert a single person, but instead mastered foreign languages, made grammars, and described the cultures they encountered. They introduced Western polyphony all over the world, as David Irving has shown in fascinating detail. And more recently, scholars have demonstrated how indigenous societies in various parts of the globe made Western music their own, as exemplified by Leonardo Weissman and Matthew Roger Grant. Thus, for instance, today in South America and Central America, there are numerous groups that perform this repertoire, and these performances are often of the highest caliber. Finally, Drew Davis has demonstrated in fascinating detail how topic theory can be applied to 17th century Mexican music. Most importantly, rather than stressing that there were a few local composers and that everybody was flown in from Europe, he has turned the question of indigenous musicians upside down by showing that much of the repertoire was improvised. And in this, he's much in agreement with research done by recent scholars on early modern European polyphony. I think they think now that something like 80% of polyphonic music until 1600 was improvised. But what about Protestant mission societies? There is little doubt that the first important Protestant missionaries were the Moravians, who started the activities in the 1730s. Until recently, they were generally perceived as an 18th century pietistic sect of little consequence. Only in the last few years have historians started to go into the archives and explore their activities. And I believe that the discoveries in these archives are fundamentally changing our view of Protestant missionary work throughout the world. In fact, I would like to suggest that the Moravians were the first truly transnational Protestant missionary community, just as the Jesuits were the first Catholic transnational missionary community. The international contacts of the Moravians were breathtaking. They went to areas no one ever missionized before, places where the most disadvantaged people lived, and this in spite of the fact that they were a small group of no more than a few thousand people. They had excellent relationships to the highest aristocratic circles all over Europe who supported their missionary activity, and music played a central role in their life. A bit of background on the Moravians. They are also called Bohemian Brethren, and they were followers of the Prague reformer Johann Hus and Jan Comenius. Since they were unable to practice their religion freely in Moravia, they left their homes and looked for a more tolerant country. Nikolaus Ludwig Graf von Zinzendorf allowed them to settle in his estate in Saxony, and they established the town of Herrnhut, which is in East Germany, right at the Polish and Czech border. This is Herrnhut from the 18th century, and here it is from the today, and it has just been named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And by the way, in German, the Moravians have a completely different name. They are called Herrnhuter Brüdergemeinde. Zinzendorf was an important religious and social reformer who provided new inspiration to this community. They were never a large religious group, but they exerted an extraordinary strong influence on religious and intellectual life in the 18th and 19th centuries, not only in Germany, but in Russia, England, and all the Scandinavian countries. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Johann Gottfried Herder, Leo Tolstoy were all admirers. The poet Novalis came from a Moravian family. And by the way, there's a wonderful book by Penelope Fitzgerald. It's called The Blue Flower, which it's a novel, but it describes pretty much how it could have been to grow up in a late 18th century Moravian family. It's really a great book. Wilhelm von Humboldt was in regular contact with the missionaries who wrote grammars for him of the many people they missionized, just as he received generous help from Jesuit missionaries in Rome. The philosopher Friedrich Schleiermacher attended a Moravian boarding school, and even though he did not remain a Moravian, the education he received had a strong impact on his thinking. Later, Protestant mission societies in England, such as the London Missionary Society and in Germany, Leipziger and Berliner Mission, generally modeled themselves on the Moravians. Nevertheless, there are four important points that distinguish the Moravians from other Protestant religious communities. First, they considered missionary activity their most important goal in life. While later missionaries always tried to convert as many people as possible, the Moravians concentrated on individual souls, whom they called first fruits, and in German they are called Erstlinge. The term derives from Revelation 14, verse 4. Quote, "These were redeemed from among men, being the first fruits unto the men." End quote. This made 18th century painting by Johann Valentin Haidt is entitled First Fruits and was reproduced in copies that survive today in the Moravian town of Zeist, which is in Holland, in Bethlehem in Pennsylvania, and in Herrnhut. Note the many different ethnicities shown in the paintings: African, Caribbean slaves, Inuit people, Native Americans, and by the way, most of them have been identified, and we know who they are. Moravian missionaries were not interested in power or nation building, but in creating and developing personal beliefs in the salvation of individual souls. From the very beginning, Moravian missionaries were instructed to respect local cultures and warned against judging the local populace by comparing them to Europeans. But of course, these instructions and ideals were not always heeded and realized. Second, Moravians managed to construct a large transnational community with close contact in the following countries: England, Ireland, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Baltic regions, and Poland, as well as missionary activities in St. Thomas, 1732 already, Greenland, North America, Suriname, 1735. Most people don't even know where it is, in South America. South Africa, 1736, the Gold Coast, 1736, Russia, 1737, Algeria, Ceylon, Persia, Egypt, Labrador, and Jamaica, and many more were added later. Here we have a drawing of Moravian mission stations from 1749, and it features the inscription Crescit in immensum, or in English, it grows immensely, and it's very likely by Zinzendorf himself. What is striking about the Moravians is the fact that they managed to maintain this shared international network until the second half of the 19th century. For Moravians, it was more important that they were part of the Moravian community and less important that they were German, Danish, Inuit, or English. They attended the same schools, whether they came from England, Denmark, Holland, or French-speaking Switzerland. A centralized administration located in Germany and Holland oversaw the worldwide community until the middle of the 19th century. In 1857, the Moravian Church split into 3 provinces, a North American, a British, and a European continental province, but they remained in close contact. Third, Moravians worldwide kept closely in touch through regular correspondence with headquarters, shared diaries, and most importantly, Gemeinnachrichten, news from the congregation. Here you have a handwritten example, which were copied and sent all over. These were read aloud. At first they were handwritten, and later they were printed. Here you have a printed one from 1819. These were read aloud on so-called Gemeintagen, which you would translate as congregation days, on one designated day each month. So here we have the mission stations where it was read out loud, but not only mission stations. So we have Haanhout in England, Fulneck in Saxony, Fulneck in England, Zeist in Netherlands, Bethlehem in Pennsylvania, and now come the mission stations. Okak in Labrador, Sarepta among the Kalmyk in Russia, New Haanhout in Greenland, New Hope in Jamaica, Grace Hill in Antigua, Paramaribo in Suriname, Mosquito Coast in Honduras, Montgomery in Tobago, and Saron in Barbados. These readings were interspersed with hymns and Bible passages. Moreover, they were regularly copied and distributed to other congregations in the country. What was included? Most importantly, news from the mission stations. It was a tremendous help for the missionaries living in complete isolation to hear how their colleagues are faring, to learn how they deal with difficult situations. Fourth, more than in any other Protestant denomination, music was a central part of their worship. The Moravian hymn book contained thousands of chorales, and these were immediately translated into local languages by the missionaries. Congregations all over the world would meet daily in their so-called Singstunden, singing hours, to sing these hymns. We can assume that most members knew these hymns by heart, and Zinzendorf inspired poets to constantly create new ones. The London hymn book of 1753 to 54 consisted of 2 volumes and included 3,627 hymns organized chronologically. So the earliest hymns are from the 15th century, from the Huss period, and they were kept and they were included. Then they have 17th century from the Comenius period and so on. Wherever they were, the Moravians would meet at least once per day just to sing hymns, but usually much more often. In addition, they sang anthems and various kinds of religious songs, as well as secular choral and instrumental music. The level of music instructions in their boarding schools, both in Europe and America, was exceptionally high. The philosopher Schleiermacher writes about the Singstunden, which in his school took place weekdays from 9 to 10 p.m., that for him they were more moving than the sermons. Students were woken up by chorales, and on Sundays and holidays, a string quartet would play chorales early in the morning. Daily devotions would also begin and end with a chorale. Niesky, as also in Saxony, the main boarding school, was a really small town of only 700 people. Nevertheless, thanks to the boarding school, there were regular performances such as C.P.E. Bach's cantata for double choir, Heilig, Graun's Passion Oratorio Tod Jesu, and Handel's oratorio, for example, Atalia. In fact, aristocrats regularly came to Niesky to listen to the performances and check out the schools for the children. Wednesdays from 10 to 2 p.m. and Sundays from 6 to 7 p.m., students would participate in a Colloquium musicum, and those who were not good enough to play were encouraged to listen. Here, Haydn's string quartets would be regularly performed. Interested students would have regular private lessons in music theory and composition, and teachers were often accomplished composers. During Schleiermacher's time, there were three really very good composers there: Johann Ludwig Freit, of whom we will hear a piece later on, Christian Ignatius Latrobe, and John Gumboldt. And missionaries took these compositions already in the 18th and early 19th century with them to the people they sought to convert. What is most astonishing is that these pieces were actually performed in the 18th and 19th century mission stations. Thus, Sarah Irely and Tom Gordon have recently shown that Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus was sung in Inuit in the early 19th century. Sometimes a religious text would be added, for example, to Haydn's string quartets, and these texts would be translated into all kinds of local languages. A central figure in the distribution of Moravian music to the mission station was Christian Ignatius Latrobe. He was a close friend of Haydn who always stayed at his London house, and an excellent musician and a competent composer. He published in 1806 a collection of sacred music, which included pieces by Handel, Haydn, Caldara, Graun, C.P.E. Bach, Hasse, Mozart, Pergolesi, Jomelli, Gluck, etc. In addition, he also distributed pieces by Moravian composers. Once all of these compositions arrived in the mission stations, they would be immediately translated into the local languages. In addition, secular compositions would be redone with a religious text in the local language. There is no better way to demonstrate the transnational nature of the Moravian world than to look at their autograph books, which I discovered in the Herrnhut archive 2 years ago. Autograph books were popular already in the early modern period when they were called Liber Amicorum. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Mozart, Chopin, Mendelssohn, and Schubert wrote many compositions into them, and these have been duly explored by musicologists. So what do we find in Moravian autograph books or Stammbücher of Moravian missionaries? Naturally, hymns in many languages, some expected, such as English, Dutch, Scandinavian languages, French, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, but some of them highly unusual, such as Inuit, Arabic, Russian, Kalmyk, which is a Mongolian language, and various African and Creole languages. Again, this is closely connected to the missionary activities. Missionaries would immediately start by compiling grammars and dictionaries, and then translate the Bible and hymns into local languages. Often these translated biblical passages refer to the importance of spreading God's word. Here, for example, we have a canon by the composer Johann Ludwig Freit, who taught at Niski, and he wrote this canon for a student of his called Joseph Jackson. Now, Joseph Jackson was also a talented composer who eventually became a missionary in Jamaica among the slaves, and many of his compositions were again transmitted, performed all over the mission stations. In addition, there are many canons like this one by composers of the Moravian school in Niski. Now I would like to talk in some detail about one particular Stammbuch, which belonged to David Nitschmann, who was one of the earliest Moravian missionaries. Moreover, his autograph book is a prime example of the transnational culture of the first Moravians. His biography conveys a sense of the widespread travels of Moravians at this time. He was born in the Moravian town of Zuchental, but because of religious persecution, he and 4 other young followers of Hus and Comenius decided to leave and settle in the town of Herrnhut. He quickly became a secretary of Zinzendorf and accompanied him in 1727 to Silesia, later to Copenhagen. He then traveled to Switzerland, which had important Moravian communities, and St. Petersburg in Russia, which had also, where they wanted to explore missionary activities. By the way, they eventually established a settlement in the Volgograd region in Russia, but in contrast to German settlers, they did not go there to profit from the fertile Russian soil, but rather to missionize the Kalmyks. I will talk more about that in a moment. Then he spent extensive time in the Baltic countries, and finally he received a long hoped for call to become a missionary in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. It took him 6 months to travel from Amsterdam to Cape Town, then another 6 months to reach Ceylon. It was not an easy voyage. 84 passengers died en route, and another 40 had to be hospitalized. We don't know, I couldn't figure out how many there were on the boat, but at the most 200, I would think. Within 18 months, they were ordered out of the country by the Dutch governor because of religious disagreements, and Nitschmann had to return to Amsterdam in 1741. The next year, he returned to Copenhagen, followed by a trip to Greenland, where important mission stations had been established earlier. From 1749 to 55, he spent most of his time in London, where he had followed Zinzendorf. In 1751, he tried to establish a mission station in Ethiopia. It wasn't successful. In 1759, he met with Danish government officials to start missionary activities in Tranquebar, East India, which was then a Danish colony. He lived his last years in the Moravian settlement in Zeist in Holland, setting up the Moravian archive there with a 1-year interruption to inspect Moravian settlements in North America. And there are entries from practically every of these places in his Stammbuch. The writers of the entries in Nitschmann's Stammbuch include most leaders of the Moravian Church. There are several references to missionary work. For instance, this drawing clearly refers to the missionary activity in Ceylon and shows an angel appearing to a number of so-called heathens. Moravians would call them first fruits, telling them about salvation through Christ with the Latin passage from Matthew 4, verse 16. The people, I'm quoting, the people which sat in darkness saw great light, and to them which sat in the region and shadow of death, light has sprung up, end quote. The Greek inscription above comes from Luke 1, verse 78, and it reads, "The day spring on high." The surrounding verses, which are not cited in the image, contain again references to missionary activities. Quote, "And thou, child, shall be called the prophet of the highest, for thou shalt go before the face of the Lord to prepare his ways, to give knowledge of salvation unto his people by the remission of their sins, through the tender mercy of our God, whereby the day spring from on high has visited us. The drawing features the Dutch red, white, and blue striped flag because Ceylon was a Dutch colony, and the open book must refer, of course, to the Bible. The next entry in Nitschmann's album is by Christian Protten, one of the most interesting people in the early Moravian church. Christian Protten was born in Christiansborg, close to Accra in present-day Ghana. He was a linguist and missionary who had a Danish father who was a simple soldier and a Ga mother, the daughter of Chief Ni Asori Ashangmu, ruler of the Ga between 1660 and 1680. After attending the so-called mulatto school, Protten moved to Copenhagen in 1726. In 1732, he began to study theology, and after meeting Zinzendorf in 1735, joined the Moravian Church and moved to Hanhout. David Nitschmann ordained him in Amsterdam in 1736, after which he left for the Gold Coast as a missionary. It seems very likely that he wrote his entry in Nitschmann's Stammbuch in Amsterdam when he was ordained. Protten returned to Europe in 1741. A year later, we find him at the Danish West Indies, returning to Europe in 1745, marrying the Caribbean-European Moravian missionary Rebecca Freundlich, also very interesting person, in 1746. Throughout his career, there are numerous tensions with Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf wrote several critical letters, and there is a strong possibility that he had an alcohol problem. Protten traveled twice more between the Gold Coast and Europe, becoming eventually a teacher at the Castle School in Christiansborg in 1765. He died in 1769. His most important contribution is a grammar of Ga and Akan, entitled A Useful Grammatical Introduction to Two Hitherto Unknown Languages, Fontaine and Acrain. He spoke at least 5 or 6 languages, among them several African languages. His contribution to Nitschmann's Stammbuch is presented here. Now, let me tell you, when I found that, I immediately sent it to Kofi Agabu, who's my dear friend. Normally, Kofi Agabu takes at least 3 days to answer an email. Within 2 hours, he wrote back. He was so excited. It was a real pleasure. Note that Protten signs his name with ex-Africa. Then he mentions at the end of the second line and the beginning of the third that the Bible passage is from Matthew 9, the last verse. The language and the... now I have to go back. I screwed up. Okay. The language is very likely Ga, as Kofi spent a day with his wife looking for it and comparing it to their Bibles, and they were quite sure right away. But since then, I've consulted with Africanists, and they also confirm it's Ga. The text in the King James Version is, "Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he will send forth laborers into his harvest." This biblical inscription refers clearly to the Moravian wish to missionize. Protten addresses Nitschmann as Theophil. That's the first word there. And Theophil is, of course, the addressee of the Acts of the Apostles, where they talk about their missionary activities. And he calls him Theophil because Nitschmann is about to become a missionary in Ceylon. This entry is the earliest written document by Protten and clearly shows that he understood that Ga is a tonal language. Note the tone marks all over over the written words. And for this reason has excited great interest among the Africanists. The autograph albums provide an insight into just how far-flung the contacts were that the Moravian missionaries established. As I mentioned earlier, they also mention music, including hymns in various languages and numerous canons. The earliest, most important center of Moravian musical activity in Africa was Genadendal in South Africa. The first Moravian missionary among the Khoi, they used to be called Hottentots, who established Genadendal was Georg Schmidt, who arrived in Genadendal in 1737. The entry dates from 1739, when Nietzscheman stopped in Cape Town on his way to Ceylon. The text is a free adaptation of Hebrew 12, verse 2 of Luther's Bible translation. I'm quoting, "Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross." End quote. The Khoi had been robbed of their original way of life and were exploited in slave-like conditions by white farmers. Perhaps because of their terrible living conditions, they were receptive to the gospel and loved the Moravian hymns and held regular Singstunden. But within 6 years, in 1743, Schmidt was forced to leave. In 1792, 3 new missionaries arrived and established an educational system which included not only singing, but instrumental performances, brass ensemble, and music theory, but of course, mainly literacy. And so now, more generally, what kinds of music did the missionaries bring with them from Germany? Were these only hymns or also anthems and instrumental music? Thus far, there is only one archive in a Moravian mission station that has been researched in great detail, the Labrador Archive. The Canadian musicologist Tom Gordon published an outstanding book on Moravian music in Nuuk just 2 years ago, entitled Called Upstairs, in which he demonstrates in fascinating detail how from the early 19th century onwards, the Inuits sang Moravian hymns for hours, but not only hymns. They sang Mozart, Haydn, Gluck, and all of the Moravian composers from the early 19th century on. It is also clear that the Inuits made this music their own by transcribing it on their own, learning notation, and repeating it and adding Inuit texts. They adjusted the repertoire to whatever orchestral and choral forces they had at their disposal, and also by providing the music with new texts. We know much less about other mission stations. Archival evidence shows that La Trobe sent his prints of early and 18th and 19th century music, as well as prints and manuscripts of Moravian music, to all mission stations all over the world. What we don't know is how it was received. A preliminary picture begins to emerge concerning South Africa. The library of the Moravian Church in Genadendal, which is in the process, by the way, of being digitalized by Dresden State Technical University, includes the editions of La Trobe that we know, as well as the major Moravian composers mentioned earlier. Then there is a large collection of musical instruments, organs, string instruments, harmoniums, brass instruments, and many others. We get some insight into how these materials were used from La Trobe's published journals of his visit to South Africa in 1815 to 16. He regularly praises the Khoi for their musicality, and there's frequent mention of hymns being sung to welcome him and other guests or sing farewell. Then there was every evening a well-attended service, which was probably a Singstunde, where the congregation consisting of Khoi and missionaries sang hymn after hymn. He also observes their singing outside the church, which was so strong that he suggested to them, to the missionaries, that the Khoi are really now ready to sing 4-part hymns. but this means that anthems weren't yet sung. All of this changed with the arrival of Christian Friedrich Franke, a highly musical missionary. Before his missionary activity in South Africa, Franke taught in the Moravian boarding school in Niski, which, as we have seen, had a strong music program. He arrived in Gnadenthal in 1837 and started out as a teacher in the teacher's training school, which especially emphasized music. He stayed in Gnadenthal only 2 years, but managed to build up a strong choir which sang not only 4-part hymns, but also Moravian anthems. Most interesting is his letter from 1839, where he wrote to La Trobe. There's an extensive correspondence between him and La Trobe. Again, I think I'm the first one to look at it, about his musical achievements in Gnadenthal. And here it is. When contemplating the Passion of our Lord, in the last week of the Passion, we performed several chorales for 4 voices, some of which previously unknown to the local congregation, and among other compositions appropriate to the celebration, the beautiful anthem by Freit, Seh ich in deinen Seelenschmerzen im Geist, o Jesu dich. As Tom Gordon has shown, the same Freit anthem was also performed in Inuit throughout the entire 19th century. It was La Trobe who brought it, of course, to Labrador. So now let's listen to it. And I would like to thank our choral conductor at UC Davis for having recorded this for me. Maybe they didn't sing quite as well as my choir, although my choir had issues too, but they did it. You probably all know that the original tonal system was pentatonic, and the fact that they were able to sing this piece, which has lots of chromatic passages, I think is quite remarkable within 2 years. In another letter to La Trobe, he continues, on the Children's Fest, in addition to an aria for which Brother Heilbeck provided the text, the well-known Hosanna, blessed he be who comes in the name of the Lord, sung with great precision and to good effect by the little ones, to the great joy of themselves and their parents who were gathered together. We believe we must encourage and cultivate the love of holy harmony with our Hottentot, old and young. So Hosianna is by far the best known composition, most popular of the Moravians. It's by the Moravian composer Christoph Gregor. It's regularly sung on the 1st of Advent, but also at other occasions throughout the year. So I have two versions for you. The first one is sung by one of the best German ensembles, Dresden Vocal Consort. And the second, which I find infinitely more moving, is by the Inuit congregation in Nuuk, just about 5 years ago in Labrador. And as I mentioned, they copied these manuscripts for 250 years and sang it and sang it and sang it. Let's listen to it. Okay, and now comes the version from by the Inuits. We also know that a local Khoi member from Brother Franke's choir took over the choir when Brother Franke was moved to Mamre after just 2 years. Quote, "Our beloved Brother Franke was in charge of the choir in order to perform multi-part compositions. When he moved to Kröneklof, he entrusted the musical instruction to whom? A Hottentot." Harmony and counterpoint were taught throughout the 19th and 20th century in Gnadentag. We can see all the normal textbooks which we know from German conservatories. There are compositions by Schumann, Mendelssohn, in addition to the expected pieces by Mozart, Haydn, Handel, Hasse, Jomelli, and so on. These compositions are often provided with new religious texts, and the scores in the archive all show signs of heavy use. Why is it so remarkable that the Khois were taught and encouraged by the missionaries to sing and play this Western repertoire? We have to remember that in the 18th and early 19th century, the prevailing assumption was that the local population in Africa, Suriname, Greenland, and America were in every respect on a much lower cultural level than the white race, that they had no aptitude for culture of any kind. Witness these words by David Hume from 1753 from his essay Moral, Political, and Literary. Quote, "I'm apt to suspect the Negroes and all other species of men to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufacturers among them, no arts, no sciences," end quote. Immanuel Kant, who identifies the Koi many times in his lectures, he of course calls them Hottentots, quotes this passage from Hume, exactly this one I just read, in Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime, from 1764. Also, Kant was convinced that the geographic and climatic conditions were to blame for the fact that they were not interested in any culture. Even though there were many 18th and 19th century scholars, among them Georg Forster and the Humboldt brothers, who did not agree with Hume and Kant, it seems that most would have considered the Khoi unlikely candidates for high culture. Therefore, it is noteworthy that the Moravians never hesitated about introducing compositions by C.P.E. Bach, Handel, Haydn, and Mozart. And by the way, as far as I know, no other missionary societies did anything like this. It's time to draw some conclusion. 1, we have seen that the Moravians formed an international network of mission stations in which the performance of classical compositions played a central role. But these classical compositions were adapted to the local conditions and culture, where they were redone to fit the languages and instruments available. 2, thus far, only the Moravian archives in Germany and the United States, Bethlehem and Winston-Salem, have been explored. But even there's a lot to be found, as I realized when I discovered these Stammbücher. The only mission archive which has been thoroughly studied is the one in Labrador. Tom Gordon published a major book, which I already told you about, and it remains one of the best studies on Moravian music. In addition, I have done some work in the archives in Tanzania and presented these results in my last book. But that is it. The archive in Gnadenthal is in the process of being digitalized, so it's difficult to get access right now. But there are important archives in Suriname, all of the Caribbean mission stations, Greenland, Nepal, Russia, Estonia, St. Thomas, Jamaica, where, by the way, the materials can be found in the attics of various mission stations, I heard. The Moravians, by the way, have once a year a meeting of all the archivists. And this is, of course, the place to go if you want to find out more about them. We know that all of these mission stations had the same music because La Trobe shipped it there. What we don't know is how it fared there. Did the local population take to it? Did they like learning Western notation? For example, in South Africa and Tanzania, we know that at first they learned Western notation. But by the early 20th century, Western notation became increasingly unpopular. Thanks to English and Scottish missionaries, the local population much preferred tonic solfa, which is a pedagogical system. Just a moment, I have it here. Here, you have an example. At first, when I found this in the Moravian archive in Tanzania, I had no idea what it was. It's very popular in England and America, but on the continent, it's completely unknown. So it teaches sight reading with psalmization syllables, but you really cannot do much with it as a notational system. In Tanzania, they also disliked the Moravian Lutheran hymns and much preferred Sanka hymns. On the other hand, the Inuits took to Moravian hymns with a vengeance and would extend their Singstunde for hours, both in Greenland and in Labrador. And to this day, they use Western notation. 3, the other important question is how Western classical music interacted with local music. We know from Kofi Agabu's important study that in most of Africa, Western tonality colonized African tonal systems, as he put it. We also know that in Suriname, many of the Moravian anthems continue to be performed to this day. And in Jamaica, there are some new, really good choirs that continue to perform 18th century polyphonic choral music. But in South Africa and Tanzania, it's completely gone. Nobody sings polyphonic music anymore. It's just a tradition which is lost. 4, finally, we would like to know whether any of these missionaries ever contemplated introducing local music into the service? Do we find any descriptions of local music? To my knowledge, the earliest missionaries to consider the possibility are Traugott Bachmann and Franz Rietzsch in Tanganyika in the early 20th century. It's really late. Rietzsch made an extremely important observation about multi-part practices among a tribe in southern Tanzania called the Wanyakyusa 40 years before Gerhard Kubik. But he failed spectacularly when he tried to introduce local music in church, as I've written in my last book. Note that even missionaries who advocated to preserve local cultures, such as the very important 19th century Greenland missionary and linguist Samuel Kleinschmidt, never considered introducing local music into the service. He wanted everything local. He wanted local food, local rituals. He was even in favor of polygamy and things like that, but never music. The most likely explanation is that for Moravians, their hymns and anthems were intimately linked to the gospel. In short, I urge you all to look at these archives and try to reconstruct the stories they will tell. I have no doubt it will be an important story. I would now like to close with a recent performance of the same Christian Gregor Hosianna, which was done during COVID by Moravian congregations all over the world.
Geloben sei der Name. Hosina, geloben sei der Name. Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is he that comes. He that comes in the name. He that comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna, blessed is he that comes. Hosanna, blessed is he that comes. Hosanna, 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 Hosanna in the highest. Hosanna, blessed is he that comes. Hosanna, blessed is he that comes. Hosanna, 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 blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna, blessed is he that comes. Hosanna, blessed is he that comes. Hosanna, 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 Hosanna in the
Thank you very much. I wonder if we could interrupt for just 2 minutes. I will be right back, okay?
Absolutely. So meanwhile, I'll just thank Anna Maria for a really fascinating and beautiful talk.
But she should wait. Barak, she should hear. Wait a minute. So that she would hear you.
Of course.
Yes. Yeah. זה סיפור מדהים.
ממש.
ממש. כן, ממש. כן.
יש אגב עוד מחקר שהיא כאילו רפררה ממש באיזה של ווילר ואיירלי, אני לא יודע אם אתם מכירים, שבעצם חקרו את המוזיקה של המורבים בקרב האינדיאנים המוהיקנים. המרינדיאנס, כאילו.
וואו.
ממש זה סיפור שהיא מספרת, אבל בקרב המוהיקנים, שהם גם נתקלו באיזה ארגז שם באיפשהו בפנסילבניה, על זה אני חושב שהיא דיברה בהקשר של פנסילבניה, והם עשו שחזורים מדהימים, הקימו אתר אינטרנט ממש, שמוקדש לשחזור כאילו במוהיקנית.
So I'm back.
Great.
Yeah, so Anna Maria, I was thanking you
Should I
for
close?
for a really wonderful and fascinating and really beautiful lecture. And Gideon was just sharing something. I don't know if you will talk about it later, but maybe we can. If you didn't talk about it in your response, maybe you can mention it in the Q&A. So now we are in our response session, and we will start with our first responder. Alexander Rosenblatt is a cultural musicologist. He is currently a senior lecturer in the Department of Literature, Art, and Music at Zefat Academic College, Israel. He holds a PhD from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of British Columbia, a visiting research fellow at the University of Victoria, BC, Canada, and a visiting scholar at the University of Southern California. He served as chairman of the Israel Musical Society and editor of the peer-reviewed journal Milad, Israel Studies in Musicology Online. He is a member of ICTMD, International Council for Traditions of Music and Dance. Dr. Rosenblatt is the author of Land, Faith, and Voice, Christian Music in the Pacific Northwest, and the book Christian Music in Jerusalem, The First 2,000 Years, both part of the Jenny Stanford series on sacred music. His research interests include music and sociocultural issues, music of Christian worship, and personalities in music. Alex, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Barak, for introducing me and for inviting me to respond. Okay, and good evening, everyone. Yeah. Okay, so first of all, I'm Professor Busse Berger for a very insightful and profound lecture. Thank you very much. As someone who has spent decades studying music, questions of identity, missionary activity, and the post-missionary presence of contemporary Anglican communities in Israel and Greater Vancouver, BC, Canada, as well as the musical trajectories of the Maronite communities across time and space, I would like to draw a number of comparisons and historical parallels between the cases analyzed in the lecture and those I have explored in my own work in terms of borrowing missionary heritage, the preservation of missionary tradition by indigenous populations, and acculturation, whether voluntary or based on changes in the surrounding sonic environment. First, I'll begin with a brief historical reference. The London Missionary Society mentioned in the lecture should not be confused with the missionary institution established there later. London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst the Jews, which together with the Church Missionary Society, also later, a Lutheran German, founded a joint Lutheran Anglican bishopric in Jerusalem in 1840. After the German missionaries left the institution 3 decades later, the bishopric gradually developed into the Anglican Diocese of Jerusalem and the Middle East, whose main laity are Christians who previously belonged to Orthodox communities, while the Jewish branch of this enterprise eventually transformed into the Messianic Jewish community, serving together with the evangelicals on the Christian side as a bridge to global Christianity. Second, the identity of the members of the Arab Anglican community in Israel is quite multifaceted, part of the global Anglican Church, including belonging to its particular branch, part of a local, that is, independent Anglican diocese, part of Arab culture, part of Arab Christian culture, which is not the same, and finally part of Arab society in Israel. The sentiments of Easterners looking to the West and Westerners living in the East were expressed by Anglican priests in Galilee in response to my questions about the Eastern melodies that were heard in greater abundance than usual in one church during Easter, and about the traditional Anglican Christmas carols that blared from the bell tower of another church, inspiring a Western-style Christmas spirit in an Arab village. Third, the musical part in the post-missionary Anglican churches represents a complex of traditions. Thus, the blending of century-old missionary hymns and Eastern melodies borrowed from other local churches and used as signifiers or musical codes of subordinate identity, that is, affiliation with a particular branch of the global Anglican Church, is a very characteristic feature of modern Arab Anglican churches, both in Israel and in the Canadian part of the Pacific Northwest. Fourth, now about the Khoi who were taught and encouraged by the missionaries to sing and play this Western repertoire. I cited. Unlike the Moravian missionaries who never hesitated about introducing compositions by CPE, Bach, Handel, Haydn, and Mozart to the indigenous audiences, as we just learned, Anglican missionaries in the Middle East who conducted their mission in the 19th century among Arab Orthodox Christians faced the problem of correctly performing hymns in the Western minor scale, which was unfamiliar to the local population. Instead, the melody could be sung in a makam close to the minor scale, for example, in the Hijaz. This is why in early editions of missionary hymn books for Anglican churches, or often for several Protestant churches, hymns in the minor mode did not constitute the standard 25% as in similar hymn books in the US or Canada. Instead, they comprised only 4% in the 1965 hymn book, gradually increasing to 11% in the 1990 hymn book, both published bilingually, Arabic and English, in Larnaca, Cyprus. The major mode is quite similar to the Makam Ajam, so no sonic conflicts or discomfort arose for the missionaries' ears. This was not due to an inability of the local people to accept Western music, but rather to a conflict with the local system of pitch organization of the time they had grown up with, which was then predominantly microtonal. The peoples of Africa and the indigenous people of North America had mainly pentatonic rather than microtonal modes, which were less hostile to Western tonality. Fifth, another my remark concerns the conclusion about classical compositions that were adapted to the local conditions and culture. I noticed such an attempt in musical activity of the Anglican Charismatic Church in Kafr Yassif, one of the Galilean villages. The musician responsible for selecting songs for services and paraliturgical gatherings told me that he takes songs from all over the world, I cite, simply baptizes them with the right words. One more example is Maronite leadership in Western countries that has made efforts to take the Maronite tradition of Syrian chant accessible and adaptable to parishioners and a wider audience, following musical patterns, semitone modes, and church harmony, typical of the musical part of Catholic worship as is currently presented in the United States and Canada. Maronite Church is part of the global Catholic Church, as we know. 6. Music plays a vital role in communication between Arab Anglican communities in Israel. Although Anglican hymnody is the common denominator for all subgroups, the musical codes of any of these groups are the melodies used for the ordinary parts of the Mass, melodies of Lebanese or at least Eastern Arabic origin, borrowed from other local churches. When guests from different denominations come to a particular Anglican church, they may be greeted with a melody typical of their church, played or sung by the priest. Melodies from another denomination, for example, Orthodox, may indicate theological differences between the denominations, with the priest singing certain words to a melody associated with that denomination. For example, as if to emphasize that when they say this, we Anglicans say that. Another reason for the use of Orthodox Byzantine melodies, as in the case of the Jerusalem Cathedral, Anglican Cathedral, is adherence to the doctrine of the Oxford movement, which in the 1830s modified millenarian doctrine, calling on the Anglican Church to return to its Catholic roots, which was partly expressed even in the use of early Byzantine melodies. This doctrine is still characteristic of the Anglican Church in South Africa, where the priest of the Jerusalem Anglican Cathedral, now a bishop, was educated and ordained. In conclusion of my brief response, I would like to emphasize that the history of the Moravian missionary work and the place of music, of classical music, within it was echoed nearly a century later in a work of other Protestant missionaries, Anglican missions in the Middle East, as well as among the indigenous populations of the Pacific Northwest and the settlers there. All of this cultural and spiritual work was underpinned by the central place of music in sacred and spiritual practices associated with worship in the Christian religion everywhere. Thank you for listening.
Very much.
Thank you so
Do
much,
you want me
Alex.
do you want me to
Thanks.
comment now, or should I wait?
Yeah, actually, that was my question for you. Would you prefer to respond now?
This is extremely interesting for me because I don't know much about these Anglicans in Israel or anywhere else. So what I'm particularly curious about is that they were aware of the differences in the tonal system clearly already in the 19th century and chose melodies which they could perform. That is quite unusual, I think, in what I have encountered. German missionaries would just say they sing out of tune. And they were completely convinced that the German, the Western tuning system is the right one, and that that they have to learn it. And when they didn't, the children did, of course, but not the others. So they were just considered unmusical at first. It was only, I noticed, only with the early 20th century that they understood that. So I think this is very interesting. And I also, the fact that they try to introduce local melodies is very unusual and interesting. So thank you very much for that. And I also like that they were inspired by the Moravians. Yeah. Moravians, by the way, were also in Palestine. They were there pretty early. So I think, and they, by the way, they still are. They have something, some place there, some school and a leper colony or something like that there. So they are still.
Yeah. Yeah, well, no, but just every person amongst the clergy, the Anglican clergy, which is independent since 1990, more or less, has studied and ordained in different places and brought with him a different tradition within the so multifaceted Anglican tradition. Yeah, it's very fascinating. It was my research for 6 years in sequence, yeah, from approximately 2005 to 2011, yeah, the field work within 7 communities. Yeah, it was fascinating, yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for your comments. Valuable.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Alex. Really fascinating. So let's
Yeah,
move
thank
on
you. Thank you,
to
Mark.
our next respondent. Gideon. Dr. Gideon Brettler is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Mandel Schollion Research Center at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He earned his PhD from Tel Aviv University in 2024 under the supervision of Professor Dorit Tanai. His dissertation investigated printed guitar music in 17th century Italy, tracing connections between musical, textual, and typographic features of guitar books and broader social and cultural developments in early modern urban centers. The interdisciplinary study combined a quantitative analysis of the Italian music printing industry with close readings of primary sources, revealing reciprocal interactions between oral and literary traditions and between elite and popular culture shaped by trends such as early modern collectionism and the professionalization of musical performance. In his current research, Dr. Brettler explores guitar music as a site of cultural exchange across geographic and social divides, including the transmission of musical knowledge between Europe and the New World. His project focuses on the symbolic association of the guitar with ethnic, social, and colonial otherness, and examines guitar books as artifacts of popular pedagogy reflecting shifting early modern educational ideals. Dr. Brettler has previously served as head of the music department at Givat Washington Academic College of Education and has taught at the Jerusalem Academy of Music and Dance, the Buchman Mehta School of Music at Tel Aviv University, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is also an active concert guitarist specializing in historically informed performance. Go ahead, Gideon.
Wow. Thanks for the introduction that I wrote for you. It's very generous. Really, I of course also prepared a very thorough response, but I really want to thank you, first of all, the end of the lecture, which kind of reiterated how music can be a unifying force across boundaries, and as you showed throughout the lecture, really across cultures. Even if at times it's imposed by force. So having said that, and I also really, before I proceed to what I prepared, what kind of arose from Alex's remarks and your discussion of them regarding the difficulty in adapting different tonal frameworks kind of shows again how this was an Enlightenment era missionary project, as opposed to later and earlier missionaries, and kind of believing in the universality of their project and of their cultural content, justifying really imposing it on other less developed primitive systems. Having said that, so I really want to thank you, Professor Busse Berger, for your willingness to come and speak to us, and a fascinating lecture and your really intriguing research. I enjoyed the lecture, and I want to take this opportunity to highlight some of the ideas that I found particularly fascinating and intriguing. I also have a few thoughts and questions that arose as I read the lecture earlier and hearing it today. So first and foremost, the scope and scale of the Moravian missionary project that you laid out before us is really very impressive. Given the breadth of the global network, the continuous lines of communication, and the kind of standard method of operations of the missionary stations spread across the globe, the argument that the Moravian missionary project served as a kind of Protestant counterpoint to the Jesuit project is really very convincing. However, for context, I think it is important to remember that by the 1730s, when the Moravians began their missionary projects, the Jesuits had already established a highly organized missionary infrastructure for nearly 2 centuries. As Professor Berger pointed out, there is an abundance of scholarly literature on musical encounters in Jesuit missions, such as the remarkable studies by David Irving that show how Jesuits introduced polyphony worldwide. Yet the Moravian archives, which have not yet been examined thoroughly, reveal a parallel, albeit chronologically later, effort to disseminate complex classical works by C.P.E. Bach, Mozart, Gluck, and others. This to the furthest reaches of the early modern world. Since the Jesuits preceded the Moravians both historically and in scholarly literature, it's difficult not to draw parallels between the 2 missionary projects. As someone who is more familiar with the Jesuit missionary project, I found both the divergences and the parallels that you presented to be very enlightening. Although throughout the lecture the Moravians were characterized in comparison with other Protestant missionaries, I think it might be useful to do so in relation to the Jesuits as well. Key differences between the two that you touched upon are the idea that the Moravians, at least at first, focused on converting individuals rather than en masse, what you described as the first fruits. I found the idea that Moravians were interested in saving souls rather than building nations particularly interesting. While the Jesuit missions often functioned as proto-political entities, the Moravian focus on first fruits suggests a more individualistic approach to conversion that may have been bypassed or even clashed with certain colonial administrative goals. So I wonder if analyzing the Moravians in this light might illuminate a triangular rather than a bipolar power structure involving the missionary community, the colonial political apparatus, and the indigenous populations, each with their own competing interests. You kind of glossed over the Moravians in the Danish colonies, the Moravians in the Dutch colonies, but didn't describe to us, what the different tensions are. I'm very familiar with the Jesuits. There's a kind of a push and pull because their interests often clash. The colonial powers and the Jesuits, of course, the local population kind of in the mix. You also note that the Moravians were encouraged not to be judgmental regarding local traditions and cultures, which put them at odds with contemporaneous racialized thought. Here I would add that the expressions of racial and or cultural superiority were in many cases motivated by the need to justify the European projects of conquest, exploitation, and enslavement of non-Europeans. This is touched upon, for example, by Arne Spohr with regards to Otto Goben's travelogues detailing German colonial efforts in West Africa. Of course, Spohr describes kind of a military and commercial conquest, not a missionary, but still he shows how these travelogues use this kind of rhetoric to justify what's going on. In the Enlightenment mindset in which the Moravians operated, their mission to save the souls of these peoples was contingent on them having souls to save to begin with, and their ability to receive Christian grace. Therefore, the very idea that these people were fundamentally lacking the abilities contradicted their foundational purpose. So I believe that this is a tension that, the Jesuits often grappled with this idea. I'm curious to know how it applies here. On the other hand, characteristics described as differentiating the Moravians from other Protestant missionary projects demonstrate their similarity to Jesuit methods of operations. So much so that one might speculate to what extent they modeled their methods on those of the Jesuits that preceded them. In this context, I would mention, 1, the global scale of Moravian operations described here, really in fascinating detail and exemplified by Nietzsche's autograph book, just for one example. The centrality of education in the missionary project, embodied in the activities of the Niesky school, which were then exported to missionary stations, like the example of Franke in the Genadendal mission. And 3, probably most importantly, the important role of music in the missionary project as a means of imposing cultural and religious values, a theme that is explored throughout the scholarship on music in colonial missions. So I have 3 sort of questions that arose for me while reading and listening to the lecture. You mentioned the spectacular failure of 20th century attempts to introduce local music into the service of the Tanganyika. Given the centrality of the hymns in Moravian religious practice and their intimate connection to the gospel, would you consider the lack of syncretic religious practices evidence of theological rigidity? In this regard, I refer to the concept of accommodatio that Makoto Takeo Harris used to describe the development of syncretic liturgical practice in the missions to Japan. Harris specifically discusses these practices in relation to what he describes as a missionary ethos of cultural openness, much like the one you described in the lecture. So were the Jesuits ultimately more flexible than the Moravians theologically, which allowed the Jesuits to more fluidity in adopting other cultural practices? You noted the readiness of the ready acceptance of Western notation among the Inuit versus its rejection in Tanzania in favor of tonic sol fa. In your archival research, have you come across instances where indigenous musicians used Western notation or otherwise to preserve or notate their own local musical traditions? I'm wondering what impact the very notion of musical literacy might have had on indigenous populations. Tomlinson's book, The Singing of the New World, comes to mind in this respect. His book kind of explores ways that that you can kind of study musical traditions without having any written evidence, but he does describe the moment that the Nahuatl Aztec cantares were printed in Western alphabet and in the context of print culture, what that mediation did to the culture, how we study it. So that was another question I have. If you any examples like this. And finally, I'm curious if these global encounters had any reverse influence on the Moravian Center in Europe. Is there evidence that musical knowledge collected in the autograph books or elsewhere, such as the tonal marks in Poten's Ga inscriptions, ever migrated back to Europe to influence Moravian composition, musical composition, of course, or intellectual life?
Thank you. Wow, this is a lot. I have a lot.
You can choose. This is what came to mind.
Well, let me first start with this colonialism. This is such an important topic, and there's no. I can go on forever. You know, first of all, the ways the missionaries traveled. They traveled with boats which were full of slaves. And they would get free room and board. I mean, or maybe not food, but they could get it. For example, when Nietzscheman went to South Africa, he got a free ride from the Dutch East India Company. Similarly, I mean, there are close connections with slave dealers all around. When Protten went back, he was on a boat with slaves. Very likely, he just wasn't with them, living with them, but he must have seen what was going on. The Moravians were officially, of course, against slavery, and they were founded. The first missionaries were sent to St. Thomas because they felt so horrible about the slaves. They heard about it at the Danish court. So the missionaries lived with the slaves. They didn't live separately, but at first they really lived with the slaves. One of the missionaries even married a former slave in St. Thomas who had been set free, which caused a tremendous scandal. They were both arrested. Zinzendorf had to go there, and he was extremely charismatic and, as I said, had connections with the highest aristocracy, and he got them out. Intermarriage was maybe not common much later, but at this point it was. But then why did the Moravians, they were officially against slavery. Nevertheless, they took advantage of it. I mean, and there were lots of discussions in the Moravian headquarters. What shall we do with this information? Because the plantation owners wanted Moravian missionaries there because they wanted to pacify the slaves. So, so there's one very interesting case, which, of course, I have also discovered in the archive in Hanut. Joseph Jackson. I think I showed you a canon which was dedicated to him. He was a composer, and he went as a Moravian missionary to Jamaica. So the Moravians went to Jamaica in the 1750s, and they were asked to come there by an English plantation owner called Barlow. And he became a Moravian himself. His children were sent to Moravian boarding schools, and he wanted to pacify his slaves. So they offered them a small plantation for free in return for spreading the gospel. So this was by no means uncontroversial among the Moravians. Can we really redo it? On the other hand, they felt a need to help the slaves, to tell them about salvation. But the way they did this conversion is also extremely interesting. So Jesus died on the cross. It's a sacrifice, right? Well, they took this to extremes. About 1/3 of the hymns are about Jesus's blood and wound and crucifixion and so on. And when they went to the slaves, they would tell them, Jesus has suffered so horribly. Your suffering is nothing in comparison. And when you're dying, they didn't consider death something horrible. Death is a salvation, and you are fine again. So this was essentially their attitude. So they established these plantations in Jamaica. And when the Moravian inspectors came and visited, they were shocked, because normally Moravian missionaries had to pay for their own upkeep. They didn't even get money from the headquarters. They were carpenters, they were tailors, and they had to support themselves. Well, these missionaries in Jamaica, they had slaves whom they treated much better than the plantation owner, but they did have slaves, and they had very nice living quarters, and the inspectors were shocked, and some didn't want this to continue. But they did continue, and they had slaves also in St. Thomas eventually, and Barbados, and all of these Caribbean islands. They didn't have them in South Africa, as far as I know, but especially and the southern states of America, they also had kept a few slaves. So it's a very problematic subject. Everybody knew about it, but nobody talked too much about it until about 10 years ago. Now they are coming out and saying, we should have protested, we shouldn't have done this. It was not right of us to do that. So it was a complicated situation. On the other hand, without the boats owned by the West India Company and the other companies, they couldn't have sent their missionaries out. So this was also, they were dependent on these gifts from these societies, and the societies wanted to do it because they wanted to keep the slaves peaceful and continue to make a lot of money. So that was that question. It's a very complicated question. Oh, and by the way, there is only one missionary group which did not have slaves, the Baptists. They were also in Jamaica. This David Irving told me this. I didn't know this. They never had slaves. They were also active as missionaries in Jamaica, but they didn't have slaves. So the Moravians, by the way, also owned 2 boats. One which was constantly going between Germany and I think Hamburg or Holland and America. And they had also one which constantly went to Greenland and Labrador. So they had some boats. What you have to understand is this was also a tremendous shock for me. Missionaries have a bad reputation in the 20th century. But there's a wonderful book by the Berkeley historian, American historian, David Hollinger, who it's called Missionaries Abroad. And he shows that missionaries in the late 19th and 20th century were the most popular people in the world. They were admired boundlessly because of the good deeds they did. And he also shows that they are responsible, and the children of the missionaries, for anti-colonialism in America. And America wouldn't, according to Hollingworth, probably not have won the war, Second World War, if they hadn't had missionary children who knew other languages. Nobody else knew these languages in the State Department. So this is also, so missionaries, they got a lot of money and they put that into these boats, the Moravian. And the Moravians were very good at fundraising and doing that. So they started to pay a small salary to their missionaries, maybe in 1850, but until then they were completely on their own. And one more thing, they died like flies, especially in the Caribbean. In Greenland and Labrador, they lived forever. The climate was much better, but there it was. They also knew they would probably die, and there would be 10 missionaries sent to St. Thomas, and within 2 years, 8 were dead, and there would come a new supply. It just went on and on. Jesuits as models. This is a very important and interesting point. I don't really know that they had much contact because Zinzendorf was a Lutheran through and through, and I mean, then he became Moravian, who they are very similar to Lutherans, but they must have known about it, and they had contact with the Humboldts, and so they must have known about this. Oh, and Zinzendorf also grew up in Halle with August Hermann Franke, who was also an early Moravian missionary. So, and they had a Wunderkammer from things from the 17th century, which is earlier than the Moravians, of unusual objects. So Zinzendorf must have seen that and been impressed with that, and that might have been why he had this wish for missionarizing. So I think definitely they share the same obsession with linguistics, with making grammars, translating, and so on, and also with high-level classical music, which they successfully managed to install everywhere, and the Moravians likewise. And I don't think other mission societies did this. I think you are completely right. This is an important point. Then, concerning the inability or the unwillingness of the local population in Africa to sing these hymns anymore and sing this music. You see, to sing their own music, to perform. This is why Rietzsch, the Moravian composer, who was such an excellent musician, failed so spectacularly. They didn't want to sing their own music. You see, their own music was often connected to local practices, religious practices, and the church elders wanted to get rid of it once and for all. They didn't want that around anymore. So I think that was the main reason.
But even in the context of the Inuits, where you describe them putting it to their own language and really embracing it, but you've described no Inuit composers, even though they all knew Western notation and were versed in polyphony.
I don't think you're right. It's very strange. The Inuit music is very different. It's if you will look at it, and I think it was in the 19th century already largely extinct. So I think people have revised it and so on, but I think, I don't know. I cannot answer that. It's a very good question. I don't know. They were certainly not encouraged to compose their own music. Of that, I'm certain, because of possible local heathen practices, but I cannot tell you more.
But even, I mean, I'm thinking of Piotr Narwat's work in the Moshos missionaries in Bolivia, where they composed Western music. They composed like trio sonatas in the style of Corelli, completely, just anonymous.
They probably did, absolutely. I think it's very likely that they would. I think this Kleinschmidt in Greenland, he trained his organists so well that they could compose new chorales, and absolutely, there are lots of them in the hymn books. And those were taken up immediately by Moravians worldwide. So they would have a hymn from Greenland, and they would sing it in various, and people, actually, some people would sing it in Inuit, some people would sing it in German, some in English. But absolutely, yeah. So that would happen. Yeah, yeah,
So interesting.
yeah. Let me see. Was there anything else? This is all I can think. But if there's something important I forgot, let me remind me.
Yeah, I asked if you kind of asked on the answer to the previous question if there was an influence in the other direction, if kind of local cultures were somehow.
Now in the 20th century, it's very strong. So now they will, of course, have African choirs left and right who have their own music, which is, of course, a mixture in some way, but they are performing all over Germany or America or whatever. No. Now they do it, yeah. But I think it took until the 20th century until they did it, as far as I know, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. These archives, by the way, the archive in Hanut, which I know best, is fantastic. It is very well organized. And I mentioned it was established by Nietzschmann in 1750s because there was a little scandal in the Moravian church, and Zinzendorf wanted to have everything documented. So it was already established then. So they have really everything there, and it's very well organized, and there's still a lot to be discovered. And the other archives are a mess. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's make two comments, two short comments. Yeah. Please? May I make two short comments?
Of course, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the first one, at one of the conferences of ICM, then ICTM, not yet okay, it was the presentation of one Chinese fellow who told and presented about church music in one of the provinces, and he played back music which he described as music from the church in his native neighbor village to his home. Okay, so the music was nothing but Johann Strauss waltz. Yeah. Okay. So sung, yes, they sung in four voices. Okay, so I was very careful to ask. Okay, so are you aware? So it has authorship. It's Strauss. He told, no, you're wrong. You didn't comprehend. It's original music from our neighbor village. So which missionary brought this music, if not Moravian one? Yeah, okay, this is the first comment. Okay. The second comment. Okay, so my project with the National Library of Israel and with Maronite communities in Israel. So the second round audio recordings from those same places where the first round recordings were made 40 years ago and 50 years ago. The same day of the church calendar, the same communities. So just to record and to make a comparison, what changed? Okay, so what changed? They lost their feeling and their ability to sing in Syrian Makam because the surroundings are already so Western pop music. So also their own music already was about Western harmony with. So the question of societies that grew up on on monophony, and if polyphony is not maintained from the source like missionaries, something like this, they probably come back to monophony, and so because it's not their own. So they are so they are less interested because not they themselves came to that. This is how I catch this. This is why contemporary post-missionary churches, on one side, so on one hand, they use missionary hymns accompanied on organ. They sing it one voice, and it's accompanied on organ. And the one voice monodist tunes from the local Arabic churches. So you see, so it's the mix which exists in the post-missionary. So I accent this in post-missionary churches. Not the missionaries did not use local motifs. It's the post-missionary epoch which brought this mixture all together. Yeah. Okay. It's what I'd like to comment that.
There's a similar case I found in northern Tanzania. So there were missionaries before the First World, German missionaries, and they introduced a hymn. And then after the Germans lost the First World War, they were not allowed to come back until about 1928 or something, and a missionary comes back. And the Africans continue to be very Christian and sing these hymns, the Lutheran hymns and so on, but they didn't recognize them anymore. They had been changed beyond belief. The only thing which helped them was the text. The melodies were completely different. Yeah. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's getting quite late here, but I would absolutely want to give everybody a chance to participate in this rich discussion. So does anybody else has any comments? Yes, Ruth, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Anna Maria. It was really fascinating, and that's the fact that you shared with us a very, very rich and fascinating study of yours. And I have several questions, but I think I will limit myself only to two. One is in terms of the archives that you have explored, and you explored so many of them, I understand. The language mainly is German, or are other languages are involved, some of the local indigenous or anything that is related to it? So that's one question. The other is a bit more complicated, and it relates to the fact that the Moravian was so close to the Lutheran, as you mentioned several times, and the whole idea of music education, it couldn't work without a kind of a policy or system of how you impart these musical techniques and thinking and cognition, all that, to such a new population without having some ideas of how one does it. So since in the Lutheran countries, Luther, together with Melanchthon, they introduced already musical education so early in the 16th century and all the way up to modern times. And to what extent did they borrow some of these methods into their missionary journeys and so on? And to what extent they had their own ways to instruct the population?
Wonderful questions. So let me tell you, these languages give me a lot of pain. So because I mean, I'm good with languages, but not that good. The Stammbuch, they have, as I said, Inuit. So that I could sort of identify. There are also archivists who have these Inuit hymn books, so there you can find. Then there was one language entry in Kalmyk. That's a Mongolian language, and it looked like Arabic to me, but I didn't know what it was. So I sent it to a linguist here at Berkeley who's fantastic. She said right away, Kalmyk. So it is really, they have languages and everything, and they have also letters from these, and these missionaries know these languages, and they knew them, and they had always somebody to help them with it. So I think this maybe the Jesuits must have had similar international outreach, but I don't think the London Missionary Society was anything like this. Now, the second question is also very good and important. You know, they took a lot from the Lutheran service. Of course, they have hymns too, and but they redid it in a drastic way. These Singstunden were central. No Lutheran would have Singstunden of this level. In Hamburg, they would have 4 or 5 a day. And if a letter would arrive from a missionary, the bell would ring, and they would all run together, and they would have a Singstunde. The letter would be read, and they would intersperse with these hymns, and they improvised with these hymns. So since would take, they had memorized about 20 melodies and thousands of texts. So Zinzendorf would start with one line or two lines, and then somebody else would continue with the same melody, but a new text, and they would be improvised on the spur of the moment or from their memorial archive, from whatever they had memorized. So this is completely unheard of. They stopped doing that around 1780. But until then, they did it because God spoke through them, through these hymns. These were religious experiences, you know, they were really intense pietists. No Lutheran would have done that, yeah. And then I think the Lutheran churches would not have been able to perform Gluck or these Handel oratorios. I mean, this is a level which no Lutheran church, maybe in the big capitals like Hamburg or Berlin, they could have done it, but not like this. I mean, this is quite unusual. So they really had much more. The kids learned this from the very beginning, and music was absolutely central. Yeah. Even now, you know, the Moravian in Germany is a small group. By the way, they were always very small. I think much smaller than the Jesuits, a few thousand at the most. But now the Moravian church in Germany continues to be small, but has fantastic music. Africa is the biggest growing Moravian church. It's the second biggest church in Tanzania. Can you imagine? They have no longer Moravian music. Of course, they have something that resembling Pentecostal, but it's thriving. It's a completely different. And also, they have huge discussions about issues such as homosexuality. Of course, the Africans are against it, and the Europeans not. So it's but they try to keep it together. It's maybe not as close as it used to be, but it is still very close. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyone else would like to chime in, ask a question?
If nobody has a question, or I may add something else regarding the concept of the first fruit. You mentioned the source in the New Testament, but it goes back to the Bible, to the Hebrew Bible, to the whole idea of what is called in the Bible Bikurim. I mean, the first fruit that is given in the temple already in the when the temple existed.
Oh, and I did that. That's
yes.
very interesting. Huh.
So it goes to that, and the whole idea of that the first should be sacrificed to God, brought to God, to the temple, to the priests that are there, and all that.
Oh.
So I wonder what they meant exactly by the first fruit. Were they interested? I mean, conceiving these new people, so to speak, coming from all these colonies and so on, as the way that they are bringing them to God as a new kind of human beings that they are offering to God.
You know, let me tell you, Ruth, this is something I don't know enough about. I'm not a theologian. I know that they knew that Zinzendorf and all these people all knew Hebrew very well. They were very well educated, and Zinzendorf was obsessed with the Old Testament, with Jews. He adored them, respected them, tried to missionize them without much success, but they were very close friends, especially in Amsterdam, yeah. But I simply don't know, but I will investigate it. There might be, you know, there are lots of very well-educated Moravian theologians who might have worked on this. I'm sure it should be possible to find out. But on the other hand, the term first fruits is only used in English. In German, they are called Erstlinge. So it means they're the first ones to have found Jesus. Yeah, I think. But you know, that doesn't contradict it at all. It could still work. Yeah, it's a very interesting thought. So where is it in the Old Testament?
It appears in the Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy.
Okay,
Deuteronomy. I can send you the exact place where it is. Where it's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
And yes,
I'm sure I will find it. Yeah, you know, there are all these Bible things. I'm sure I will find it.
Yeah.
I mean, I would think that's the Moravians knew about that. I would think it's very likely because they knew everything inside out. But I'm not sure. But that's my suspicion. Because they would have Oh, by the way, I didn't tell you about one thing about the Moravians. Now and not only now, for 150 years at least, they have enormous income because they have something called losung. So they have a lottery where they choose for every day of the year a verse from the Old Testament, a suitable verse which goes with that from the New Testament, and one of their many hymns. So they of course put them into special categories that they go together, but it is a bestseller of unprecedented proportions. It's sold in all over the world. Catholics use it, Lutherans use it, everybody uses it, and it is translated into something like 100 languages. I mean, this is the main source of income, and it's very cheap, and you can also get it online. By the way, they will send it to you in any language you want. It's unbelievable. So I can, thinking about this losung, I think they probably knew about this correspondence with Erstlinger, but I don't know for sure. Thank you very much. A very interesting point.
Pleasure.
Okay, it's still getting quite late here. What do you know? But honestly, I would probably hear about Moravians for 2 more hours if I could, but I think it's probably time to finish to close up the session. So I would like to thank Gideon and Alex for brilliant responses, and of course Anna Maria for such a beautiful and fascinating lecture and really such an interesting and rich discussion afterwards. And thanks, Ruth, for your always insightful questions and comments. And thank you all for connecting. And we'll see you all in the next session.
It's a pleasure to be there for you.
Thank you so much.
So much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.
Yeah,
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you also for the
Bye-bye.
speakers, Alex and so on.
Yeah.
Alex and Gideon. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Good night.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you.